Grace, mercy, and peace be to you from God, our Creator, and the reigning Messiah, Jesus. Amen. I'd like for us to focus for a few minutes on that conversation between Jesus and Pilate we just heard read. It seems to clearly differentiate between two very different kinds of kingdom. There's the typical human type of kingdom characterized by what? Fighting, says Jesus. He's correct, isn't he? Have you ever known a human government that doesn't rely on armed soldiers and police forces? But then there's implied this other kind of kingdom, which comes from somewhere else other than the human world, which Jesus, as we already know, was sent to save. For God so loved the world that God sent the Son to save it. But as Jesus stands before the representative of the typical human empire, about to be condemned to death, what kind of kingdom is Jesus representing? As Messiah, apparently it will be a kingdom from God that is established not by dishing out violence, but by suffering it in love. A kingdom that comes into the world by suffering violence rather than inflicting it? Who's heard of that? What kind of kingdom is that? And that's why Jesus is trying to be clear that the kingdom he was sent to establish is not from our world. Two kingdoms, two different worlds. That's what Jesus not only hints to Pilate about, but then he also makes that happen through dying on the cross. One kind of kingdom already around for centuries of our human history depends on dishing out the violence. The other kingdom, which is established by suffering the violence in love, is about to come into this wider world created by God. And it's a reign apparently from the Creator God, and it's through the cross. One of my favorite preachers and authors is Brian Zahnd, and he wrote a book about the cross titled "The Wood Between the Worlds." That's, I think, what we experience on this holy day. A piece of wood that appears to be a portal between two worlds. Now, throughout most of history, that piece of wood has been primarily known as a particular instrument of death. It was a portal, if you will, for that person to leave this world in death. But in this one spectacular case, which made this Friday good, this piece of wood has somehow come to represent a portal to life. Because Jesus dying on it has transformed this wood into a portal between two worlds. Between our typical human worlds that dish out so much death, and God's world, which yields not death, but endless life. Because this time, we believe, that piece of wood known as a cross bore the author of life itself. John's gospel begins by portraying Jesus as the Word, with a capital W, right? which created life from the very beginning. And as Pastor Matt talked about last night, that word is love. By suffering our human violence in love, the cross of Jesus the Messiah has opened a portal to God's realm of endless life, that those who have faith in this doorway can follow Jesus right through it, so to speak, when their life on this earth is done. That's the portal we Christians have celebrated with gusto since the first Easter, and we will do so again in a couple days, right? But I want to raise another possibility tonight, one I think we have mostly forgotten about. Namely, that the portal of the cross, this wood between the worlds, goes both ways. In fact, I think the Gospel of John and the other Gospels were mostly interested in the cross as a portal in the other direction. In other words, the cross is also a portal for God's world, God's reign, to enter into our human worlds. The Gospels talk all about Jesus himself proclaiming what? The coming of God's reign into the world. So I propose to you tonight that what today and Easter are all about is much more than simply having a doorway for us into God's endless power of life when we die, as amazing and wonderful and marvelous as that is. But that there's something perhaps much bigger in a way. That these 3 days are also about the wood between the worlds working the other way too. The cross and resurrection are also the portal of God's reign coming into the world of our human reigns to begin to transform them towards life rather than death, precisely by suffering our typical deadly violence on the cross. Here's something I see as potential bad news, though, too. I think the cross as a two-way portal means we have some repenting to do. Because the church's alliance with empire over the past 15 centuries or so has, I think, intended to ignore the cross in the other direction as a portal of God's reign coming into the world, which makes sense. Because why? Because God's reign directly challenges our reigns based on violence and injustice. So we've conveniently accepted the singular focus on the cross solely as a portal into God's power of endless life when we die. It's also been recently that I think we've begun to see some bold examples of Christians having faith in the cross as a portal in the other direction. It's always been there, but I think it's becoming, I hope, more prominent again. Namely, as a portal of God's reign, challenging us to make our human reigns better, to be more just by being more life-giving to everyone. What does it take to be able to see the cross as a portal in that other direction? I think we need to learn to read the Bible in some renewed ways. But that's a big task for another time. I'd like to end with simply juxtaposing some images. The first is a painting by Frank Dixie in 1900, and I think it captures the situation of the church allied with empire, which we sometimes refer to as Christendom, or maybe even the current version that calls itself Christian nationalism. Follow the eyes of the king on the war horse. Do you see him gazing at the other king, the one in the upper right-hand corner who's on a cross and wearing a crown of thorns? What is the look on the face of the king wearing a jeweled crown? Surprised? Confused? Unsettled? Do you suppose he might intuit that this other king challenges his authority? But, of course, not with a violent army. Instead, by suffering our typical violence in love. On the next slide, I'd like to consider something from our more recent history that we might ask, does this photo depict something where we can begin to imagine the cross again as a portal for God's reign coming into the world? Jesus versus Pilate, the two kingdoms facing off, if you will. Could this be a glimpse of what the clash between the two kingdoms looks like in our recent history? And finally, one last picture of the same event. Does this portray the beloved community John talks about in his gospel? Can we begin to glimpse what God's reign might look like in our lived history? I leave you pondering that last question especially. What would that look like right now? As there's once again an increase of violence all around us, how might these 3 days of experiencing the cross and the resurrection open our eyes to the possibilities of new life for our world right now? This world that God so loved, that God sent the Son to save it. As we celebrate on Sundays God's victory over death, does it include more than that promise of life for us as individuals? Can we also celebrate God's reign of conquering death to include things like engaging the forces of death, so typical to our human reigns of violence? Tonight we ponder this biggest mystery of all, the mystery of the wood between the worlds, that God vanquishes all the powers of death precisely by suffering our violence in love. Love, the power of life itself. How might we participate more fully in the days and weeks ahead in that power of life right now, here in this time and place, for the sake of this broken world that God so loves?